Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a brand new video. Today I would like to read to you from the Jewish Study Bible. This is page 2153, and this is about the canonization of the Bible. Canonization, the process through which the Bible became the Bible, is only imperfectly understood. We do not know when the concept of the Bible developed, exactly how various books came to be part of the Bible to the exclusion of others, how these books were put into a particular order and divided into sections, and how their precise wording was established. Since there are no contemporaneous descriptions of this process, it needs to be reconstructed from indirect evidence, namely from the variety of biblical texts from different periods and places, and from later traditions in rabbinic, early Christian, and other sources that discuss the formation of the Bible. Thus, the construction suggested below is tentative. The definitions. Canon is a Greek word meaning reed, R-E-E-D, and came to refer to any straight stick used for measuring. This basic meaning was extended to refer to any rule or standard by which things could be compared or judged, what is in and what is out. The Alexandrian grammarian, classical Greek writers who were also literary critics, used canon for the list of standard or classic authors who were worthy of attention and imitation. These lists were not closed, and these scholars disputed adding or removing works from them. Furthermore, inclusion in the list merely recognized a work's quality. It did not confer upon it any new status. Thus, a canon of writings came to denote those texts that were of central importance to a given group. The term is applied somewhat imprecisely for the Bible, since the earliest evidence we have for understanding the development of the Tanakh does not come from book lists that delimit precisely what works are included. This is different from the situation concerning the early Christian Bible, where early book lists are found. Other ideas known from the canonization of the Christian Bible have until recently been inappropriately assumed to be true for the Hebrew Bible as well. When used in reference to the Bible, canon conveys something beyond its meaning. In Greek culture, a closed list of approved writings. Not only is a given set of texts included, but all other texts, no matter how worthy or useful, are excluded. Canon in this sense is closed and unchangeable, and eventually all canonical books were thought of as inspired. This is expressed in a rabbinic comment on the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes, in chapter 12, verse 12, the biblical text reads, "Of anything beyond this, my child, beware of making many books. There is no end." The rabbinic comments explain, those who bring more than 24 books, which is the standard rabbinic number of books in the Tanakh, into their house introduce confusion. And the word in Hebrew is mahuma, into their house. This suggests not only that the works in the canon are important, but that they, along with their authoritative interpretation, are sufficient in and of themselves. Once the biblical canon was fixed, there could be no additions to it or subtractions from it. It is likely, however, that before this idea of fixed, unchangeable canon developed, there was a looser idea, a canon concept, or an incipient canon, the Tanakh. It is extremely difficult to trace how this conception of canon first developed, and how it is connected to associated but not identical notions, such as the eventual stabilization of the biblical text. Until the mid-20th century of the Common Era, many scholars thought that the canon of the Tanakh was established at Jamnia, the Council of Jamnia, which is obviously this council is It has nothing to do with the canonization of the Hebrew Bible. A city near the Mediterranean coast west of Jerusalem that was a center of Jewish learning after the destruction of the Second Temple, which is in 70 CE. According to this theory, a group of rabbis met there in about 90 of CE and debated and voted on whether or not certain books were canonical. At the end of this meeting, the official contents of the Bible were supposedly established. This overly neat reconstruction was based on a misunderstanding of rabbinic texts and is now rejected. The rabbinic texts that tell of these debates do not concern granting canonical status to particular books, but reflect certain ambivalences toward particular biblical books, such as Song of Solomon, which were already in the canon and whose canonical presence needed to be justified. Unfortunately, evidence is not available to offer a clear picture of how the canon of the Bible was formed, since much of the material from early Jewish sources, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, rabbinic texts, and the 1st century historian Josephus, and Christian sources, is ambiguous or biased. This much is clear. The canon of the Bible did not develop at a single moment in time, but rather in stages over many years. There is general agreement that the Torah was the first section of the Bible to be recognized as central by the Jewish community, as a document worthy of intensive study and interpretation. Exactly when this happened is uncertain. Many scholars associate this development with Ezra and see the law of your God in Ezra 7:14, with which Ezra was entrusted in the 5th century before the Common Era as the Torah. This assertion likely goes beyond the evidence of the text, though the Jewish community had recognized the Torah as central to its identity by the Persian period, which is from the 6th to the 4th century before the Common Era. A conclusion suggested by citations of Torah material as authoritative in biblical books from this period. For example, the books of Chronicle, Ezra, and Nehemiah. It is unclear exactly how this happened or whether this development was fostered by internal or external factors and should be associated primarily with a single individual such as Ezra, the scribe, or should be seen as part of a larger, gradual, or more complicated process that likely began during the Babylonian exile. According to rabbinic tradition, the Torah is the first part of a tripartite, 3 parts, canon, followed by the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and Ketuvim, the writings, forming a work that much later was known by the acronym Tanakh, which refers to the Tanakh, which refers to the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Nevi'im is composed of the book of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and these are all seen as one book. The book of Kings seen as one book, because in the Christian Bible we have 1st and 2nd Kings, but in this Hebrew, the Jewish understanding is that we have Kings as one book. I'm talking about the way the Jewish canon is, not you go to NRSV or King James. That's not the Jewish canon. The latter prophets, consisting of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets, which is Hosea through Malachi, seen as one book. The order of these 8 books has been relatively stable, although the order of the 3 major prophets is different in the Talmud and in the Septuagint, which the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible has a slightly different order of the first half of the minor prophets. Ketuvim is composed of the following 11 books, which by contrast appear in a wide variety of orders in various book lists and biblical manuscripts. This extreme variability suggests that Ketuvim was the latest section to be canonized. The number of canonical books according to traditional Jewish sources is thus 24, 5 in the Torah, 8 in the Nevi'im, and 11 in the Ketuvim. We do not know when the acronym Tanakh originated. Rabbinic texts recognize a tripartite canon where Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim are used for each part of the canon. Their Aram equivalent to Oraita or Neve or Chitive could be used as a general term for the Bible as a whole. Though in some classical rabbinic literature this cumbersome locution is not generally employed. We'll skip a few passages here. The acronym Tanakh is first found in Masoretic literature in the form of NK. Okay. Tanakh, a Hebrew reflection of this Masoretic term, is also found in Masoretic literature. It would thus seem that the term originated in the late first millennium with the flourishing of the Masoretic movement. In contrast to earlier Jewish terms for the Bible, which did not explicitly distinguish between different parts of the canon, the term Tanakh may be understood as creating clearer dividing lines between the canonical sections, in some cases even explicitly suggesting priority of Torah over Nevi'im and Ketuvim. The origin of the tripartite canon has been a topic of debate, with several scholars suggesting that a two-part canon, the Torah and other works, was the original form, and that only later was it divided into three parts, references to the law and the prophets, seemingly as synonymous with the Bible. For example, in Matthew 7:12 and other New Testament books may support this. Evidence for a tripartite canon may appear in such sources as the prologue to the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, 2nd century before the Common Era, which says that many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophet and the others. What are the other books that followed them? And Luke chapter 24 verse 44, which refers to the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, possibly a name for the third canonical division, named after its first book. Disagree with this, because if you take again, we do not need to go into the Islamic interpretation of it, because the Psalms is basically also known as again, not really, we cannot be certain, but the Psalm of David. The tripartite canon, whenever it developed, is not fully logical or consistent in assigning books to particular canonical divisions. This likely reflects the gradual nature of the canonization process, with Nevi'im canonized before Ketuvim. This would explain why the Ketuvim contains the book of the prophet Daniel, dating from the 2nd century before the Common Era, which logically belongs with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12th. Because Daniel, historically, well, according to the narrative, it is located, pretty much closer to the time of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so on and so forth, in the 5th century. Although Isaiah was much later, if you look at the narrative, simply narrative, mostly first Isaiah. It would also clarify why Ketuvim contains several late historical books, such as Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, which would seem more appropriately to belong with similar works such as Joshua and Kings. The tripartite canon most likely suggests, therefore, that Torah was canonized in the Persian period, followed by the canonization of Nevi'im in the late Persian or early Greek period, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, while the Ketuvim texts were canonized last, probably by the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. It is difficult to determine exactly when the books of the Ketuvim were canonized beyond observing that this must have been after the completion of its latest book, mostly by Daniel in 164 BCE. The tripartite division is not the only one known in antiquity. nor is the number of 24 books the only number mentioned in ancient Jewish sources. The Samaritan community only had the Torah as its canon. Josephus is often cited as evidence for the Jewish canon in the 1st century of the Common Era, but there may have been several competing notions of canon in this period, meaning there are many different canons. It's not just simply referring to the canons that we have today. But there may have been several competing notions of canon in this period, and he should not be taken as normative for all of Judaism in his time, because Judaism wasn't monolithic. He is, however, apparently the earliest source to suggest a closed canon, consisting of 22 biblical books. He also draws a striking contrast between the Jewish justly accredited books and Greek literature, noting that Jews would cheerfully die for their books. Since he does not list his 22 books, it is not clear if he simply had a smaller canon than the rabbinic list of 24 books, or if instead his canon had the text in a different order, combined in different ways, perhaps putting Ruth and Judges after Jeremiah, and treating these smaller books as appendices to the ones they follow, rather than as independent works. Such an arrangement would yield 22 books, a number that conveniently corresponds to the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Some early Christian sources also cite this as the number of books in the Bible. The placement of Ruth and Lamentation, the book of Lamentation, mentioned above, is found in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, which began in Alexandria, Egypt in the 3rd century, for the Jewish community there. According to this originally Jewish tradition mentioned by some early church fathers from the 2nd century and later, and reflected in the arrangement of the earliest extant comprehensive Greek Septuagint manuscripts, which is the 4th century CE, the Hebrew Bible is divided into 4 parts: the Torah, the book of histories, the poetical book and wisdom books, and the prophets. The division and order continue to be used in the Christian Old Testament. Older scholarships spoke of this 4-part book arrangement as the Alexandrian canon, in contrast to the tripartite Palestinian canon. But scholars now acknowledge that such a clear geographical dichotomy never existed. Scholars also now recognize that even when canonization took place, the wording of the Bible did not absolutely freeze. Evidence suggests that by the 2nd century of the Common Era, the biblical text had largely stabilized. This is reflected in the few manuscripts we have from this period from near the Dead Sea, as well as the development of early rabbinic midrash, much of which presupposes a stable text. The destruction of the Second Temple and the Hadrianic persecution of the early 2nd century of the Common Era may have also caused a type of conservatism which was responsible for establishing the biblical text. These were gradual and to some extent incomplete processes, and it is difficult to understand exactly how they were accomplished before the advent of the printing press. It is important to remember that different Jewish groups from the early 1st millennium may have had different ideas of what comprised scripture. For instance, it is unlikely that the Qumran community, most of whose texts date from a century or so immediately before and immediately after the Common Era, viewed the book of Esther as part of their Bible, since no manuscripts of that biblical book has been found among the thousands of fragments discovered. In contrast, over a dozen manuscripts of the Book of Jubilees, a work similar to Genesis and Exodus, have survived, and it is referred to as authoritative in that community's work. Given this work's affinities with the practices of the Dead Sea community, it was probably a very significant text for them. Yet using the term canon in reference to this community is problematic, since their many writings never contain a term that seems to mean the Bible, nor is it clear that they had a notion of a closed set of texts that was special. In rabbinic literature, the wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach okay, or the book of Ecclesiasticus, a book in the Apocrypha but not in the Hebrew Bible, is occasionally cited with same formula used for introducing biblical texts and was thus in some sense canonical for some rabbis. Therefore, although we can probably speak of the canon having formed by the first century of the Common Era, there was a certain amount of fluidity or variability around the fringes. This fluidity also applies to the extensive divergence in the wording of the biblical text as shown in manuscripts from Qumran, in translation of the Bible in the Septuagint and elsewhere, and to a lesser extent in early rabbinic citations. Some of these differences are small and insignificant, such as variant spelling, but some are of major significance and affect the meaning of the text. There are cases where the text is found in two or more different recensions, identifiably different versions, not merely two different copies of the same original with minor variants. Okay, which may vary the order of materials or may exhibit fundamentally different text types. Okay, for example, short types versus expansive types, and also with the text of Jeremiah, we have like different examples. One Psalm scroll from Qumran, 11 QPS, contains many different wordings for psalms preserved in our Bible, a different order for some psalms, and some additional compositions not found in our Psalter. This evidence suggests that at least in the early stages of the canonization process, it was quite acceptable for a book to circulate in different versions, and that different communities may have canonized different versions of the same book. Comparative evidence indicates that a community could hold a book to be sacred without a definitive notion of the precise wording of the book. The most basic question is why certain books were canonized while others were not. Books that were excluded from the Jewish canon had in some cases been translated in the Septuagint and were therefore canonized in the Christian community as apocrypha. Others were lost or survived as pseudepigrapha, writings that is falsely attributed to major biblical figures. And these were only preserved in fragmentary form, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of these excluded books explicitly date from after the Persian period, which is later than the advent of Alexander the Great, which is in the 3rd century of the Common Era, before the Common Era, and thus were seen as too recent to be eligible for inclusion in the canon. For example, the book of Daniel and perhaps the book of Ecclesiasticus is from this late date, but they profess to have been written earlier and thus could be included in the Bible. In various ways, the canonical status of a book or group of books arises from the community's view of their centrality, authority, sacredness, and inspiration. All terms that are difficult to define and disentangle. The song, for instance, was originally an erotic love poem. By the early rabbinic period, it had come to be interpreted allegorically as a love poem between God and Israel. The book's superscription suggests that it was seen as an inspired composition of Solomon himself. The superscription and the allegorical reading are two pieces of evidence suggestive of the process whereby song was transformed from a love poem into a biblical book. We do not know either of these ways of reading the song began, but the result was the transformation of secular love poetry into a holy book, understood as written under divine inspiration and recounting the relationship between God and Israel. Despite major uncertainties in our understanding of the process of canonization, several points seem fairly certain. First, the process of canonization was gradual and it began long before the rabbis. It is likely that its final stages were reached by Okay, by the first century, or if not before the first century of the Common Era, perhaps as a reaction to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and its aftermath. Some believe that the idea of canon developed a bit later in reaction to the emergent Christian community, which viewed a different, broader set of texts as central. This crisis in 70 intensified a development that had begun over half a millennium earlier with the destruction of the First Temple, which is in 586 of the Common Era, or before the Common Era. Through this development, Israel gradually became the people of the book, a term first found in the Quran, in reference to the Jews and Christians. Second, it is unlikely that canonization represents a purely top-down process through which a small group of leaders, the rabbis, for example, determine the canon instead of the designation of certain works as canonical was more the official recognition of the works that a large or important segment of the community had already held to be central, holy, or authoritative. Meaning it wasn't the rabbis who had a lot of things to do with the canonization. They simply picked up because the community had already used a set of books that they seems to be that according to them seems to be inspired. Finally, the act of canonization was remarkably inclusive, creating a body of works richly textured by a wide variety of genres, ideologies, and theologies. This is fundamentally a typical ancient Near Eastern process. Instead of creating a small, highly consistent text, as we perhaps would now do, those responsible for the process made efforts to include many of the viewpoints in ancient Israel, incorporating differing and even contradictory traditions into this single and singular book that came to be called the Bible. Now, to summarize here, basically the development of the canonization or the process of canonizing the Tanakh wasn't so much a one-way street kind of thing. There's a lot of different ideas. For example, some scholars believe that when after the canonization of the Christian scripture, the Jews reacted because, again, the Christians and Jews, they do not go along, and so the rabbis had to come up with their own text or their own scripture or their own set of books. Okay. There are some that believe that the process has nothing to do with a reaction towards the Christian community. This all happens within the first 5 centuries of the Common Era. Because if we look at the Qumran dynasty community, they did use a set of books, okay, but they never really had a close canon. This basically means that scholars today cannot say that only this set of books that are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are the only ones that are being used. In fact, this is highly not the case, because there are many fragmentary copies that are found as well that are of different books, okay, some of which we no longer have extant. And so basically the article here is a summarized version of the canonization of the Bible, focusing more on the Tanakh, obviously, because this is the Jewish study Bible. And so anyway, there's a lot of mistakes here in the writings, and it's so hard to read. But anyway, I'll see you guys in my next video. Hopefully this has been helpful to you, and I'll see you next time. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.